There was silence in the home, the type that seeped into the walls. I had become used to this type of quiet in the months since Daniel's business trips had increased, and my days felt like a never-ending cycle of chores, errands, and empty spaces. It was the kind of silence that intensified every floorboard creak and every gentle sigh of the wind against the windows. I was folding laundry in the hallway that afternoon, a routine, mundane activity that kept my hands occupied while my thoughts roamed, the place where conversation used to reside. As I put on socks and well-folded towels, the subtle aroma of fabric softener permeated the air, and my mind wandered to the times when things weren't so quiet. I saw the little glimmer of light peeking out from behind Mason's bedroom door at that moment. I first didn't give it much attention. He must have accidentally left it on. I had been living with my stepson, Mason. I went to his room to turn out the light since he had been quiet, reticent, and a bit disoriented after dropping out of college for 6 months at the age of 19. He was always courteous, though. The room seemed to have shrunk around us as Mason's head snapped up to meet my gaze. His face turned crimson, the flush spreading from his cheeks to his neck. For a moment, neither of us moved, frozen in a tableau of shock and disbelief. My footsteps were quiet on the wooden floor as I pushed the door open. The monotonous rhythm of the day shattered, and there he was. Mason sat on the edge of his bed, his head slightly bowed, and something in his hands halted my movement. As my eyes focused on what he was holding, my favorite pair of lace pants, my heart lurched. The words he was struggling to speak were drowned out by the frantic rhythm of my pulse, which I wanted to think was an innocent mistake. But the way his fingers curled around the delicate fabric and the small tremor in his palms suggested a different tale. I was simply bringing them to you. My breath caught, and I became aware that I had not spoken or moved. You should have stepped back, shut the door, and let it go. Thank you. Oh, I controlled my voice carefully. Well, you ought to have. I went back to my washing and acted as though this particular moment had never occurred, but instead I remained motionless, my gaze darting between his and the garment in his hands, a tiny, ashamed part of me flashing, something I hadn't felt in years. It was a perilous, forbidden sensation, the type that made your skin feel electrified and sent a chill down your spine. Mason sprang up suddenly, almost losing the underwear in his hurry. I wasn't. What I meant by it was nothing. He stumbled over each other when he pushed the garment in my direction and screamed out his redanials. They're yours to take. I'm not even sure who those wide, anxious eyes were, but they met mine once more, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something that reflected the mayhem. Did I have humiliation, guilt, or something else brewing inside of me? Almost without thinking, I stretched out and touched his hand to take the underwear. It was a quick interaction, but I retreated, feeling as though static electricity was snagging between us, grabbing the lace tightly in my palm like it was a lifeline. Ah, thank you. I said it again, barely audible, and he nodded while swallowing forcefully. His Adam's apple began to bobble. I'll let you handle it, I guess. He brushed by me, and I moved out of the way, his cologne still smelling strong. Down the hall he vanished. I gently closed the door behind me, my heart thumping as I leaned against the wood. What had happened? I looked down at the pants in my hand, the delicate fabric feeling strange against my fingers. My mind was racing with ideas I knew I shouldn't be thinking, ideas that made my cheeks flush with shame and something else I couldn't identify. For years, I had felt that Invisible Daniel's work had taken up most of his time, leaving little room for us. Before this odd, unexpected moment, I had been a ghost in my own existence, floating through the days undetected and unaffected. But suddenly I felt seen. As I rushed back to the wash, I made an effort to ignore the hazardous notion, but the picture of Mason sitting on his bed with my underwear in his hands remained in my head like an echo in my head that night. The stillness that typically surrounded me felt thick and intense while I did the supper preparation. With his gaze focused on his plate and his actions rigid, Mason sat at the table. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I kept replaying the moment in my mind. I caught him looking at me once or twice, but he quickly looked away each time. The tension between us was evident, an unspoken undercurrent that neither of us dared to acknowledge. But it was there, woven into the fabric of every word, every glance, and every accidental touch. That was incorrect. I shifted onto my side, gripping the blanket firmly as my mind raced, knowing that it also roused something within me that I had long believed to be buried. Though I secretly knew that this was only the beginning, I convinced myself it was just a moment that would pass. The next day, the house's air felt thicker, as if the tension from the previous day had been absorbed by the walls themselves. Even though I woke up early, the events of the previous afternoon continued to haunt me like a ghost every time I closed my eyes. I could see Mason on the edge of his bed, his hands gripping my lace, that delicate lace, the way he had looked at me, his eyes wide with guilt, or was it something else that had become ingrained in my mind? My thoughts kept returning to that moment when Daniel had called, no matter how many times I cleaned the countertops or folded the clothes. I went through my morning routine mechanically, hoping that the monotony of duties would distract me. "How's everything at home?" he inquired in his typical, aloof and preoccupied voice early that morning. I was certain he didn't want the response to be okay, so I answered in a voice that was too forced and cheerful. "Mason has been really helpful." Everything was fine. The words tasted weird on my tongue, like a lie I didn't fully understand. But by the time afternoon arrived, the house was quiet once more, save for the faint hum of the laundry room's washing machine. Mason had gone to his room after breakfast, and I hadn't seen him since. I convinced myself that the only way to get back to normal between us was to distance ourselves, but I hesitated as I passed his door on my way to the kitchen. My heart raced as I contemplated knocking on the door, which was just open enough to let me catch a glimpse of his chamber. But before I could decide, it creaked open. A.A. Mason was standing barefoot, wearing a basic t-shirt and trousers that dropped low on his hips, when his words stunned me even more. The way he stared at me, uncertain and hesitant, made my breath stop. I had just begun, but my voice drifted off. His hair was a little messy, as if he had been raking his hands through it all morning. I wasn't even sure what justification I was going to make. "Did you require anything?" he inquired as he moved aside to make way for me. Even though I was hesitant, I was drawn in by the kind look on his face. "Just checking in to see how you were doing. All day you have been in here." He laughed a little uncomfortable. The words lingered between us, thick with implication. "Yeah, I've just been thinking." He pointed to the little desk in the corner, which was piled high with notebooks and a half-empty coffee mug. "Would you like to sit down?" I nodded and started to walk before my thoughts could catch up. He had been seated in the chair beside the bed that day, and I could still make out the faint silhouette of his seat. Before I could apologize, Mason started talking softly about yesterday. "It's okay," I murmured at last, "but I didn't mean for it to make you uncomfortable." The word seemed incorrect, too basic to describe the flurry of feelings I'd been experiencing since then. The words sounded meaningless. Let's forget about it, although I knew it was a lie even as I said it. There was no room for forgetting. With his eyebrows fluttering, Mason nodded. Before falling to the ground, there was a pause, a deep quiet that made it seem as though the world had momentarily stopped spinning. He began again, his voice cracking. I didn't intend to. My chest tightened at the vulnerability in his words, and I'm not sure what's wrong with me. Natural impulse made me reach out, and my palm briefly touched his arm. Nevertheless, it was plenty to chill me. I said, "Mason, there's nothing wrong with you. My voice was softer than I had intended, and he looked up before his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach turn. "Hey," he redanieled in a kind tone. With a slight hesitation, I said, "Hey," attempting to seem casual. He nodded hungrily. "Going farther into the kitchen? It smells nice." I felt his presence behind me, near enough that the little hairs on the back of my neck stood on point, and I smiled, though it seemed more like a reflex than a sincere emotion as I turned back to the cutting board. "Is there anything I can do?" With a slightly closer voice, he inquired. I paused, letting my palm rest on the veggies. I looked over my shoulder and replied, "Sure, you can stir the sauce." He walked by me, and I tried not to notice the brief contact of his arm against mine. He then picked up the wooden spoon and started stirring the pot. The only sounds in the room for a short while were the gentle boiling of the sauce and the faint scrape of the spoon on the pot as he moved slowly and deliberately on the burner. The quiet seemed heavy, as though there was something unsaid in the air between us. "Tonight you look silent," I replied at last. When I spoke barely above a whisper, he looked at me, and his lips formed a tiny, almost shy smile. "I guess I've just been thinking a lot about what I asked," he said softly as he turned to face him. "I've been thinking about you for a moment," he said, his eyes briefly falling to the ground before meeting mine. It was so meaningful that the words hovered between us that I nearly missed it. My neck started to flush, and my breath stuck in my throat. I began, but my voice trailed off. "Mason." He moved in closer, and the distance between us became nearly intolerable. "I don't want to make things strange," he began in a calm but vulnerable voice, "but I can't get you looking at me the other day." I swallowed hard, my heart thumping so loudly I thought he could hear. Nothing happened. It seemed like a lie, but I spoke quickly. "Did it?" he inquired with serious, steadfast eyes, and I wasn't sure how to react. My entire rationality was telling me to back off, put some distance between us, and put an end to whatever was going on. The heat from the stove seemed to flood the room, or perhaps it was something else completely, but my body deceived me, stuck in place, and pulled to the calm intensity in his gaze before it got too far. "Mason," I said again, my voice softer this time, almost pleading, and he reached out. His hand brushed mine, light, almost hesitant, but it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore the way my fingers twitched under his. And for a moment neither of us moved. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath my feet, and all I could do was let myself fall. "I don't want to cause you any discomfort," he replied quietly. Almost in a whisper I said, "You're not," before I could stop myself. He looked into my eyes as though seeking approval or some indication that what he was doing wasn't completely terrible. And then he leaned in before I had a chance to think or even breathe. It was not a kiss. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "because I should have. I knew I should." His lips hovered so close to mine that I could feel the warmth of his breath and the subtle scent of mint lingering between us. My heart raced, and my pulse beat in a wild rhythm that matched the crackling of the electric air. But I closed my eyes to the smallest of movements that felt like the end of the world. His lips tentatively and softly touched mine, and the whisper of a kiss sent a wave of heat through me. My hands moved on their own, one finding the counter for support and the other resting lightly on his chest. All I could hear was the warmth of his lips, the steady throb of his heartbeat beneath my hand, and the quiet intensity of his presence. When he withdrew, his eyes searched mine once more, filled with something I couldn't quite name. I shook my head, interrupting him. "Avoid apologizing." I was astounded by the words, when they appeared to surprise him, but now that they were out there, dangling in the air like a confession or an unrecoverable secret, the oven's timer sounded, and its sharp beep cut through the tension like a blade. We both jumped. The spell was broken, and I turned away. I murmured, trembling, I should check on dinner. As I hurried to the stove with my cheeks burning, he stood aside to give me room, but I could still feel his eyes on me while I worked. The rest of the evening was a haze of courteous conversation and clinking silverware, but the air between us was still heavy from what had just transpired. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind repeatedly relived the moment, the feel of his lips, the heat of his touch, and the unspoken promise that lingered between us. I knew I ought to have felt bad. I should have felt regret, but I didn't, at least not completely. The evening had reached that delicate balance between light and dark, and the floor of the living room was covered in long, golden streaks from the fading sun. I sipped my wine while sitting on the couch with my legs curled beneath me. The home was silent, but for the gentle hum of the air conditioner and the sporadic creak of the wooden beams above Mason, who was in the kitchen searching through the refrigerator while resting lightly on my palm. I heard the quiet rustle of plastic and the subtle clink of bottles as he looked for something, but I couldn't tell what it was, since the atmosphere between us had been heavy with something neither of us wanted to define, and had been present since yesterday night. He reappeared a second later. He looked at me as he crossed the room, his lips curving into a small, almost shy smile. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gripping a bag of pretzels in one hand and a beer in the other. His t-shirt clung to his body in a way that made it impossible to ignore the subtle strength in his shoulders and the effortless grace in his movements. He pointed to the vacant couch seat and asked. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry as he sat down close enough that I could feel the slight warmth radiating from his body. He placed the pretzels on the coffee table and then leaned back, stretching his arm along the back of the couch in a way that felt both casual and deliberate. For a while, we didn't talk. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was thick, weighted with the tension that had been building for days. As I sipped my wine, I tried to concentrate on the glass in my hand instead of the way his knee touched mine, causing a shiver to run down my spine. "You seem different tonight," he said abruptly, his voice low and quiet as if he were afraid to break the delicate spell between us. I turned to face him, my brows furrowing slightly differently as he shrugged, his eyes flickering over me in a way that made my skin sting. I'm not sure if I was joyful or relaxed because I laughed quietly. The sound stuck in my throat. Swirling my glass of wine, I said, "I don't know if I'd call it happy, but I guess I do feel lighter." With his unblinking and steady eyes, he asked me a question that left me speechless. How could I describe it? The weird, forbidden rush that had been rushing through me since the previous evening. His touch and presence ignited a sensation within me that I hadn't felt in years. His palm slid and then rested softly on the back of the sofa, inches from my shoulder. Finally, I answered, "I'm not sure," my voice barely audible above a whisper. The closeness made my heart beat, my pulse a wild pounding, thumped in my ears. "You deserve to feel happy," he whispered in a low, resonant voice. I was taken aback by the words, which struck me like a shock. I turned to face him completely, gasping as our eyes locked. There was something in his eyes, a calm want and intensity, that made it difficult to take my eyes off of him. Mason moved in, his face inches from mine, and I began, but my voice trailed off. He said, "Tell me to stop." His voice was almost audible, and the words hung between us, heavy and charged. I looked for comfort or approval, but I couldn't tell. All I knew was that my body was still. His fingers shifted, and I pulled away, my words trailing off. His warm, electrifying touch, which was gentle across my shoulder, sent a thrill through me that I couldn't ignore. His fingers continued to trace a slow, methodical trail down my arm until they found my hand lying gently on my thigh. The brief, almost tentative touch ignited my skin with an intensity I hadn't felt in years. "You may tell me to stop," he repeated. I ought to have spoken up when he spoke. his voice a steady, low hum that seemed to reverberate in the space between us. I should have moved away, established space, and done everything I could to break the spell that was imprisoning us. But instead, I allowed my hand to move almost on its own until my fingers touched Donald's. Anything was preferable to losing contact with Donald, and the room felt incredibly small. The air was heavy and thick as his hand closed around mine, his grip firm but gentle, and my heart was pounding. I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I said, "I don't want you to stop." His eyes darkened, his stare searing into mine as he drew closer, his breath warm on my cheek. "Do you have any doubts?" "What?" he inquired. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and then his lips were on mine. They were tentative and soft at first, as if he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into the kiss, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath my palm as his hand moved to cup my cheek. His fingers tangled in my hair. There was a quiet urgency to his touch, a hunger that matched the storm building inside me when we finally moved apart. I couldn't identify the rush of feelings I had as our breaths mixed in the tiny space between us. Relief, guilt, fear, excitement. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice tremulous as I gazed at him. Jazzy added, "I know," he replied, his hand still lightly resting on my cheek, "but it doesn't feel wrong." The sound of the clock ticking on the wall drew me back to reality, and I pushed away a little, my breath still coming in short spurts, even though the voice in the back of my head was asking me to stop. The words made me shudder, and I closed my eyes and leaned into his touch. We should have started, but as his gaze met mine, the words seized my throat. His quiet resolve caused my pulse to twitch. "Should he?" In a quiet voice, he inquired. However, I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was no turning back, and all I knew was that the distinction between good and evil had become completely hazy. The only sound in the house was the ticking of the clock on the wall, which served as a silent reminder of the stillness all around me. I was sitting on the couch in the living room with a blanket over my legs and a half-empty glass of wine on the side table, listening to the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through the windows. Earlier, Daniel had called to let us know he would be out. Another night? Another in a never-ending series of nights that I had long since stopped being startled by these calls. But something about this one felt heavier, more lonely than the others. I leaned back against the cushions and stared at the muted TV screen that was playing an old sitcom that I wasn't really watching. My mind was elsewhere, caught up in the quiet tension that had built up between Mason and me, like a storm waiting to break. I was startled by a soft creak of the floorboard, and I turned to see Mason standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light from the hallway. He was barefoot, dressed in a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair disheveled as if he had just run his fingers through it, unable to fall asleep. "No, you," I paused, then nodded. I inquired in a voice quieter than I meant, and he shook his head before entering the room. "The same." He went over and took a seat. There was a tension in the air that neither of us seemed eager to talk about for long. The cushion on the far end of the sofa dipped slightly beneath his weight, and the distance between us felt both enormous and incomprehensibly little. A subtle buzz from the TV filled the room as we sat in silence. I pulled the blanket tighter around myself as I became acutely aware of how close he was to the quiet intensity because of the way he was staring at me. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the silence at last. His voice was low and almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure whether to say what I had asked aloud, and he turned to face me. My breath hitched and a flush crept up my neck as he paused, his eyes dipping to the floor before reaching mine. His words about everything about you lingered thick and unavoidable in the air. I started to add, "You don't have to say anything," but Mason interrupted me in a steady, calm voice. "Simply put, I had to let you know I'm looking at you, Nora." His statement made my chest clench. I see how much you do, how much you give, and how little you get in return. He said, you deserve more than that. You deserve to be happy. He looked at me with the type of sincerity I saw in his eyes, and it had been a long time since anybody had talked to me in that way. I uttered, I'm speechless, Kua. I hardly raised my voice beyond a whisper. You don't have to say anything, he said. His eyes were steady and unblinking. All I wanted was for you to be aware of the quiet. The next moment was profound, filled with a weight that none of us dared to express. My pulse raced as I turned away, trying to make sense of the feelings churning inside of me. I believe I should go to bed, stated at last, but I didn't entirely accept the words since they seemed phony. His gaze stayed fixed on me, imbued with an inexplicable sense of fragility and danger. As I stood there, the blanket slipped from my shoulders, and his hand reached out and lightly touched mine. The contact was brief, almost unintentional, but it gave me a chill that I couldn't ignore. With a quivering voice, I whispered, Good night, Mason. Slightly good night, Nora. He said in a quiet, nearly whispery voice. I turned and headed down the hall, my legs shaky as my mind swirled with ideas I couldn't sort out until I got to my room. Leaning against the door, my heart thumping in my chest, I shut it behind me. The home was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the recollection of his touch and his words. Then, as I got into bed, the evening's weight fell on me, heavy and unavoidable. I told myself that this was finished and that I could go on, but I knew deep inside that it wasn't true. This was only the beginning. The night seemed alive in a way that I couldn't quite describe. The air carried a strange electricity, a charged hum that made every movement and sound seem amplified. The soft whir of the ceiling fan above seemed louder than usual, and the distant croak of a tree branch outside the window echoed faintly. I was sitting in the living room, looking at a book that I wasn't really reading, with my legs folded under me on the couch. Daniel was no longer there. The emptiness of the house gave me another nod. The emotional absence that persisted, a shadow that spanned the corners of every room, was what I disliked most, not the physical isolation. I had been used to it. I inhaled deeply and looked at the time. When I went for the wine glass on the table, I heard a slight creak coming from down the hall, but my hand stopped in midair. It was late, but not late enough to seem like an excuse to go to bed. Mason was barefoot, wearing sweatpants and a loose t-shirt, and his hair was a little unkempt, as if he had just woken up or couldn't sleep. I turned to face the sound as he appeared. Hey, Chasmingam, he said softly, his voice barely audible above a whisper. Hey, I answered, matching his tone. He is unable to sleep. The tiniest smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he shook his head and leaned against the doorway. You're not actually, though. The gap seemed like it was full of questions that neither of us wanted to ask. He moved cautiously inside the room. He made cautious movements, as if he were trying things out. He pointed to the couch and asked if it would be okay if I joined you. He crossed the room and sank into the cushion next to me, close enough that I could feel the slight warmth radiating from his body. He stretched his arms along the back of the couch, his movements fluid but cautious as though he were trying not to disturb the delicate air between us. Of course not, I said, my voice steady, though my pulse quickened a little. For a while, neither of us spoke. There was a heavy yet comfortable quiet. I sipped my wine, my eyes focused on the glass as I swirled the liquid, watching the way the light caught the deep red hue. You've been quiet lately, he said, breaking the stillness. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he should say it. I glanced at him, my brows furrowing slightly. It was the kind of silence that encouraged reflection, making every unspoken word feel louder. Did I? Yes, you're often, I don't know, lighter, he said, nodding with a steady stare. But recently, you seem to be thinking about something. I responded, I guess I've just been tired. with a light grin that felt more like a reflex than genuine humor. However, the words didn't fully convey the weight bearing down on me, since I was tired of what he asked, and his eyes were searching mine. I paused, uncertain of how to respond, how to explain the strange, restless ache that had taken root in me, the sense of longing I couldn't quite name, and everything I finally said was hardly audible. His eyes didn't stray, and for a brief moment I felt vulnerable, as if he could see right through the carefully erected barriers I had put up around myself. "You are worthy of better." Know that he spoke in a stern yet calm tone. The sharpness of his tone stunned me, and I blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he paused, his fingers twitching a little. He said, his voice even softer, "I see you every day. You do everything for everyone, for Daniel, for me, and I don't think anyone really sees you." The words hit me like a jolt, and I felt my chest tighten. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged the weight I carried and the silent sacrifices I made. At what was now almost a whisper, my breath ceased, and a flush began to creep up my neck. His eyes were unwaveringly steady, and I was unable to take my eyes off of him. I started to speak, but something in his eyes, something raw and vulnerable, caused my pulse to quicken. When he reached out, his hand briefly touched me, almost unintentionally, but it sent a shockwave through me that made it impossible to ignore. My fingers trembled beneath his, and for a little minute neither of us moved. "I apologize," he replied, swiftly withdrawing his hand. "It wasn't my intention." "It's all right," I interrupted him. The quiet dragged on for a little longer, but this time it seemed different, heavier, more charged. I finally muttered, "I should probably go to bed," but I wasn't sure if I was attempting to comfort him or myself. My voice was steadier than I felt. I didn't trust the words, and they seemed like phony justification. I wanted to experience that again. "Yes," he said in a quiet voice, "and I did too." But neither of us moved. The air between us was heavy with unspoken words and emotions we couldn't name but couldn't ignore. My heart was thumping in my chest, and my pulse had a wild rhythm that matched the electricity crackling in the space between us. "Good night," I responded, a little shaky, Mason. "Good night, Eva," he muttered, his voice no more than a whisper. I rose up, the blanket falling off my shoulders as I turned and headed toward the hallway. His eyes were on me, and even as I slipped out of sight, I could still feel their weight. I shut the door behind me and leaned against my chamber, the silence of the home pressing in on me, but my thoughts were anything but calm. I felt my chest rise and fall as I fought to catch my breath. But silently, I crawled into bed and drew the covers up to my chin. I stared at the ceiling while the events of the evening replayed in my head, telling myself it was nothing more than a moment of vulnerability. Although I felt in my heart that this wasn't true and that it wasn't yet done, I stayed,